There is a dying widow, a bleeding stranger on the ground, and two children caught between hope and danger. When Delka finds the nameless man outside her shed, she has no idea that her decision will change everything. Sometimes showing mercy can save a life and create a whole new family. The blood dripped slowly onto the dusty floor. Each drop was a silent scream in the morning silence. Dalka stood frozen to the spot, the wet laundry in her trembling hands. Her eyes fixed on the man collapsed in front of the shed. His exhausted horse snorted heavily and lowered its head as if begging for forgiveness. Mother Cull's voice cut through the silence like a knife. The 15-year-old approached cautiously, his hand instinctively reaching for the old shotgun on the wall. "Who is that?" He did not answer immediately. Her eyes wandered over the stranger. His torn clothes clung to his body, stained with dried blood and sweat. Beneath his dirty, dented hat, she recognized a pale, sunken face marked with pain. His chest rose and fell almost imperceptibly. "He's dying," she whispered, more to herself than to her son. The stranger's horse staggered and sank to its front legs. Her stomach clenched. They barely had enough oats for their two skinny goats, or bread for the next 3 days. And now this. "Should we leave him there?" Kell's voice was quiet, but she could hear the coldness in it. He had learned too early that compassion was a luxury they couldn't afford. Iron knelt beside the man. His breath was weak and irregular. Under his shirt, she could see at least 3 bullet holes, the edges of which were already inflamed. Whoever had done this had done a thorough job. "Help me," she said suddenly. "What?" Kell stared at her in disbelief. "Mother, we can't. Help me." Her voice grew firmer. "Let's take him to the shed." The stranger was heavier than he looked. Together, they dragged him across the uneven ground. Tolo, her 10-year-old son, stepped out of the hut, sleepy-eyed, and watched the scene unfold. "Mom, who's that?" asked the little boy, rubbing his eyes. "Someone who needs help," her mother replied, curtly, laying the man on an old blanket in the shed. In the dim light of the shed, the stranger looked even worse. His skin was pale and his lips were almost white. Haran cautiously began to unbutton his blood-crusted shirt. Kell looked away. "This won't work," he muttered. "We have no medicine and no money for a doctor." Iron ignored him. Moving with the confidence she had gained from her own experience of illness, she began to clean the wounds. Her hands were no longer shaking. In that moment, she was not the sick widow who prayed every night for her family's survival. She was a woman who knew what had to be done. The man groaned softly as she carefully removed the first bullet. His eyes opened slightly, revealing confused, gray orbs that seemed to search the dim light of the shed. "Where?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Quiet," she said gently. "You're safe." He tried to sit up, but his body refused to obey him. Instead, he muttered a single word. "Darren? Is that your name?" she asked. He nodded weakly before closing his eyes again. Hours passed. Haran cleaned and bandaged the wounds, while Kill reluctantly fetched water and Tolo prowled curiously nearby. The sun was already high in the sky by the time she had finished. "Now what?" Kell asked. His voice sounded resigned. She looked at the sleeping man. His breathing had become calmer and steadier. "Now we wait." For what? For him to tell us who tried to kill him and why. Kyle stared at his mother. "Do you think he'll put us in danger?" Iron took the old shotgun and leaned it against the wall next to the door. Someone who's been beaten up like that always brings danger with them. The only question is whether it comes from him or follows him. He climbed onto the roof of the shed and peered over the endless hills of the prairie, looking for clouds of dust or the glint of weapons in the distance. But there was nothing, just the usual silence that lay over their small piece of land like a heavy blanket. "Why are you helping him?" Thalo asked on the third morning, watching his mother bring Darren fresh water. Iran paused. It was a simple question, but the answer was complicated.
Because it's the right thing to do, she said finally. But we don't have enough, the boy insisted. You always say we don't have enough. That was true. Since her husband was killed by a runaway horse while building a fence 2 years ago, they had been living hand to mouth. Their small vegetable garden yielded just enough to get them through the winter, and the 2 goats produced barely enough milk for the children. Sometimes Iran would quietly say, "We have to do the right thing, even if it's hard." Thalo nodded, even though he didn't really understand. At 10 years old, the world was still simple for him. Black and white, right and wrong. He didn't know that his mother lay awake at night calculating how many days their supplies would last, how long she could hide her illness, and how she would raise her sons alone. When Darren opened his eyes on the 4th day and looked at her properly, she knew that everything would change. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice was hoarse but firm. He tried to sit up, and this time he managed it, even though his face was contorted with pain. Let us know in the comments where you're listening, and don't forget to give us a thumbs up. "You should rest," Iran said. Darren shook his head. "I've rested too long." He glanced at the shotgun on the wall, then back at her. "Did you get in trouble because of me?" "Not yet, but you're expecting some." There was no question. Iran nodded slowly. Darren swung his legs over the edge of the makeshift bed. His movements were stiff and painful, but determined. "I should go." "You can barely stand." "This isn't your problem." "Yes, it is." The words came out harder than Iran had intended. "I brought you here. I nursed you back to health. That makes it my problem." Darren looked at her with a strange expression. "Why?" "What do you mean?" "Why did you help me? You don't know me. You don't know what I've done." Iran sat down on an old wooden block opposite him. "What did you do?" There was a long silence. Darren stared down at his hands as if he could find the answers there. "Nothing good," he said finally. "Did you kill someone?" He raised his head and looked directly at her. "Yes." The honesty in his voice hit her like a blow. Iran felt her stomach tighten, but she didn't look away. "Were you an outlaw?" "No." Darren hesitated. "Not officially." "What does that mean?" "It means that sometimes the law isn't right, and you have to make your own choices." Outside, they could hear Thalo laughing as he played with the goats. Such an innocent, normal sound in this tense situation. "The men who hurt you," said Iran. "Will they come?" Darren nodded slowly. "Sooner or later. They think I'm dead, but they'll want to make sure." "How many?" 3, maybe 4. Nakia calculated quickly.
Kyle could shoot, but he was still just a boy. She was a good shot herself, but she was weak from illness. As for Darren, she didn't know how good he was in a fight, especially when injured. "We could go to the city," she suggested. "That wouldn't achieve anything. They would find us there, putting innocent people in danger. Then we'll stay here and fight." Darren stared at her as if she had said something crazy. "You have 2 children." "Exactly, and I will protect them." Something changed in his face. The hard mask of pain and resignation cracked, and Irene saw something else beneath it. Perhaps respect or admiration. "You're not like other women," he said quietly. "I'm a mother. That makes a difference." Darren nodded slowly. "Yes, it does." He tried to stand up, but immediately staggered. Irene reached out to support him. "Thank you," he murmured. Their faces were suddenly very close. She could feel his warm breath and smell the sweat and blood, as well as something else. Something masculine and comforting that she had missed since her husband's death. She quickly stepped back. "You should eat something," she said hastily. "I'll make some soup." As she left the shed, she felt his gaze on her back. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. But deep down, she knew the quiet days were over. On the 5th day, Darren started working. Irene found him early that morning in front of the shed, struggling to repair a broken fence board. His movements were slow and careful, yet determined. Despite the cool morning breeze, sweat beaded on his forehead. "What are you doing?" she asked roughly. He didn't look up.
I'm paying my debts." "You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do." He paused and looked at her. His gray eyes were serious, almost sad. "Every bite of bread, every sip of water, every night under your roof. It all has to be paid for." Irene understood. It wasn't just a matter of pride. It was a survival instinct. In this harsh world, nothing came for free, and debts could be deadly. Toxilo appeared around the corner of the house, saw Darren working, and immediately joined him. The boy wasn't afraid of the stranger. In fact, he seemed fascinated by this quiet man who had appeared from nowhere. "Can I help?" asked Toxilo. Darren smiled for the first time since he arrived. It was only a faint smile, but it transformed his whole face. "Can you hold the nails?" Kyle watched the scene from the doorway, his expression skeptical. When his mother approached him, he shook his head. "You trust him too quickly," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Look at him, Mother. Look at the way he moves and observes his surroundings. He's not a farmer or a merchant. He's someone who's learned to kill." Irene couldn't disagree. She had also noticed how Darren's eyes constantly scanned the horizon and how his hand instinctively moved to his hip, where a knife would normally hang. "Maybe," she said, "but he's also someone who almost died and still repaired our fence. Out of guilt, out of decency." Kyle sighed. He was old enough to understand the dangers of the world at 15, but still young enough to think in black and white. To him, Darren was either a hero or a villain. He didn't know any shades of gray. The days passed quietly. Darren worked every morning, taking on small tasks that he could manage with his injured arms. He repaired the roof of the chicken coop, sharpened blunt tools, and patched holes in water buckets. He never spoke much, yet his presence transformed the atmosphere of the small farmstead. Toxilo followed him everywhere like a loyal dog. Since his father's death, the boy had been searching for a male role model, and Darren filled that void effortlessly. He showed Toxilo how to split wood properly, how to tie knots that wouldn't come undone, and how to read animal tracks in the dust. "My dad could do that too," Toxilo said one afternoon as they repaired the goat trough together. Darren paused in his work. "Tell me about him." "He was strong and funny. He could lift me up with one hand." Toxilo's voice grew quieter, but the horse was louder. "I'm sorry," Darren said simply. "Mom says he's in heaven now, watching over us." "Your mom is a wise woman." "Will you watch over us too?" The question was so direct and innocent that Darren couldn't answer immediately. He glanced over at Irene, who was hanging up the laundry and pretending not to listen. "As long as I'm here," he finally replied. "And how long will you stay?" "I don't know," he replied, but the truth was more complicated. Darren felt himself growing stronger every day. His wounds were healing, and his strength was returning. Soon he would be able to ride again. He would be the man who had shot 3 men in a bar because they had terrorized an innocent family. He was a man hunted by law enforcement, not because he was a criminal, but because he had disrupted their corrupt business. Watched her go about her daily chores, working the small plot of land, tending to the animals, and raising their sons. She was tougher than she looked, but he also noticed the signs she was trying to hide. The occasional coughing fit, the dark circles under her eyes, and the way she leaned on things when she thought no one was looking. She was really sick, not just tired or overworked, and she was trying to hide it from her children. The evening of the 8th day, after the boys had gone to bed, he broached the subject. "You should see a doctor." Irene, who was washing up, froze. "What are you talking about?" "You know what I'm talking about." She put the plate down too hard on the table. It jumped and cracked. "I'm healthy." "No, you're not." "You don't know me well enough to make that judgment." Darren stood up and stepped closer. "I know death well enough, and I see it in your eyes." Irene spun around. Her eyes flashed with anger. "You have no right." "I have the right of someone who owes you your life." The anger left her as suddenly as it had come. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Darren really saw her, not the strong mother or the independent widow, but a woman who was afraid. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. "I don't have money for a doctor, and even if I did, what would I tell my sons?" Darren stepped closer. "You tell them the truth. The truth is that they won't have anyone when I die." "That's not true." "Oh no!" Irene laughed bitterly. "Who will take care of them? My sister in St. Louis who hasn't written to me in 20 years? The neighbors who can barely survive themselves?" Darren didn't answer right away. Outside, a lonely, plaintive howl of a coyote echoed through the night. "You're not going to die," he finally said. "You can't promise that." "Yes, I can." There was something in his tone that made her look up. His eyes were hard and determined, the eyes of a man who kept his promises no matter the cost. "Darren, I won't let you die, and I won't leave your sons alone." The words hung between them like an oath. Irene felt her eyes grow wet and turned away. "You won't stay here," she said softly. "You can't. Sooner or later they'll come." She didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what she meant. When his pursuers arrived, Darren would have to fight, and fights often ended in death. "Then we'll see," Darren replied, although he already knew what he had to do. This woman and these children had become something he never expected. They had become his family, and family was to be protected at all costs. On the 12th day, they heard the horseman.
His hand froze on the hammer. His eyes immediately scanned the horizon. There was a small but clearly visible cloud of dust on the western hill. "Get inside," he calmly told Talo, who was standing next to him. "But I'll help you." The seriousness in his voice prevented the boy from arguing. Talo ran to the house where Ira was peeling potatoes. Meanwhile, Darren climbed down from the well, his movements suddenly fluid and painless. The adrenaline masked all discomfort. "Cale," he called. The older boy appeared immediately, shotgun already in hand. He had also noticed the riders. "3," Cale said tersely. "4," Darren corrected. "1 is holding back." They watched as the riders approached. Darren didn't recognize them yet, but the relaxed and arrogant way they rode, as if they owned the whole prairie, told him everything. "It's them," he muttered. Iris stepped out of the house, Talo close behind her. "What's going on?" "The men who were chasing me are here." Her face turned pale, but her voice remained calm. "What should we do?" Darren thought quickly. It was 4 against 3, or actually 4 against 1, because he couldn't really count Ira and the boys as fighters. The odds were bad, especially without his weapons. "Go inside," he said. "I'll talk to them." "No," she said firmly. "This is our land. We're staying. Ira, row." She stepped closer to him. "Whatever stands between you and them, you're part of our family now, and families stick together." Darren stared at her. Family. The word sounded foreign to him, yet it felt as warm as a fire on a cold evening. The riders were now close enough to make out details. 4 men in dusty coats, heavily armed. Darren recognized the leader immediately. Jake Morrison, a man with the conscience of a reptile and the temper of an angry bull. They stopped in front of the house, their horses snorting with exertion. Morrison pushed back his hat and grinned. "Well, look who's here," he said in his smoky voice. "Darren Cale, we thought you were dead." "Sorry to disappoint you." Morrison laughed an ugly laugh. "Oh, you can make it up to me. Get on your horse, and we'll finish what we started." "I don't think so." That wasn't a request. Morrison pulled his Colt halfway out of its holster. "You're coming with us, or we're taking you with us. Dead or alive." Darren felt the atmosphere around him change. Cale crouched slightly, his shotgun ready to fire. Iris stepped forward and placed herself protectively in front of Talo. "This man is our guest," she said calmly. Morrison turned his head towards her, as if noticing her for the first time. His eyes wandered over her figure, and his grin grew wider and more hostile. "A pretty widow," he said to his men. "No wonder our friend Darren Cale feels so at home here." "Careful," warned Darren in a dangerously low voice. Morrison swung himself off his horse. "You're going to stop me? You're hurt, unarmed, and alone. He's not alone. All heads turned to Cale. The 15-year-old had raised his shotgun and was now pointing it directly at Morrison's chest. Morrison laughed again. "That old shotgun can blow a hole in your chest big enough to fit a fist," Cale said calmly. There was something about the way the boy held the gun that made Morrison pause. This was not the uncertain stance of a beginner. Cale knew how to shoot. "Interesting," Morrison muttered. "A family of fighters." He made a gesture, and his 3 companions dismounted too. The situation escalated quickly. "Last offer," Darren said to Morrison. "Come with us, and the woman and the boy will be fine." "And if I don't?" Morrison shrugged. "Then we'll burn the house down and take what we want anyway." Darren felt his muscles tense. He was unarmed, still not fully recovered, and facing 4 armed men. But a desperate man could be more dangerous than an armed one. "Jake," he said slowly, "do you remember Tombstone?" Morrison frowned. "What about Tombstone?" "Do you remember what I told you before I shot your 3 friends?" The memory made Morrison freeze. Darren had single-handedly taken down 4 men who had terrorized a family. Just like now. "That was different," Morrison said, but his voice sounded less confident. "No," Darren said, taking a step forward. "It was exactly the same. You threatened innocent people, and you know what happened." Morrison glanced at his men, then back at Darren. The confidence had drained from his face, replaced with something Darren recognized all too well. Doubt. "You're unarmed," Morrison repeated, but it sounded like an attempt to convince himself. "Am I?" Darren smiled coldly. "Take a closer look, Jake." Morrison followed his gaze. Cale was still standing there with his shotgun raised, but Morrison had now noticed Ira. The woman had moved and was now standing next to an old water trough, her hand on the axe's handle. Even Talo had disappeared. The 10-year-old was nowhere to be seen, which meant he must be hiding somewhere. Morrison knew from experience that hidden children often posed the greatest danger. "A family," Darren said quietly. "A real family, not like your gang of greedy people, Jake. These people would die for each other. Would your men do that for you?" Morrison glanced at his companions. Their faces betrayed uncertainty. They had come to kill a wounded man, not to fight an entire family. "That doesn't change anything," Morrison said, but his voice had lost its strength. "It does." Darren took another step forward. "It changes everything, because now it's not just about me. Now it's about them. And for them, I'll kill all of you if I have to." The silence that followed was as tense as a bowstring. Morrison recalculated his chances. 4 armed men against 1 unarmed man, but that unarmed man was Darren Cale, and he had allies. Suddenly stones whistled through the air. Talo had climbed onto the roof of the shed and was bombarding the intruders with whatever he could find. One of the stones hit Morrison on the head, knocking his hat off. "You little rat," he cursed, reaching for his Colt. That was the mistake Darren had been waiting for. He jumped forward, grabbed Morrison's wrist, and twisted it brutally. The Colt fell into the dust. At that very moment, Cale fired. The sound was deafening in the silence of the prairie. One of Morrison's men screamed and grabbed his bleeding shoulder. Darren took advantage of the confusion. He pushed Morrison back, picked up the fallen Colt, and aimed it at the remaining men. "The next shot goes through the heart," he said calmly. Morrison scrambled to his feet, his face bearing the marks of anger and humiliation. "This isn't over, Cale." "Yes, it is." Darren raised the Colt. "You have 3 seconds to get out of here, then I'll start shooting." Morrison hesitated for a moment and then helped his wounded companion onto the horse. The riders retreated, but Morrison turned around once more. "We'll be back," he shouted, "with more men." "Then we'll be ready," Urin replied firmly. As the riders disappeared into the distance, Darren finally lowered his weapon. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The fight had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit.
Talo jumped down from the roof and ran to them. "Did we win?" Darren looked first at their leader, then at Cale, and finally at the little boy. "Yes," he said quietly. "We won." But they all knew that this was only the first victory. Morrison would return, and next time he would be prepared. After Morrison's visit, they all spent the night in the house. Darren sat by the window with the captured colt in his lap, keeping watch. His eyes wandered incessantly over the moonlit prairie. His N brought him strong black coffee that tasted of chicory and warmed his stomach. "You need to sleep," she said quietly. "Not tonight." She sat down next to him on the bench. "Tell me about him. About Morrison." Darren took a sip of coffee and wondered where to start. Jake Morrison is no ordinary outlaw. He works for wealthy city dwellers, men who want to keep their hands clean while others do the dirty work. What dirty work? Intimidating witnesses, driving families off their land, and killing people who ask too many questions, for example. Darren stared out into the darkness. Morrison is a mercenary. He kills for money, and he's good at it. And you stopped him. "I was trying to protect a family. The Kellys had a small ranch, not unlike yours. When they refused to sell their land to a railroad company, the company sent Morrison." Erin waited patiently while Darren gathered his thoughts. Morrison tortured the father in front of his wife and children in an attempt to force him to sell the land. Darren's voice grew harder. "I was too late to save the man," he continued. "But I was able to stop Morrison and his men before they killed the woman and children." "You killed them all?" "3 of them. Morrison got away." Darren turned to her. "It was the law that made me a wanted man, not Morrison. Do you know why?" Erin shook her head, knowing that the men who pay Morrison also pay the sheriffs, judges, and politicians. Darren laughed bitterly. "Morrison is listed as a businessman. I'm the outlaw. That's not fair. Justice is a luxury that only the rich can afford." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, a coyote howled again, closer this time. "He'll come back," Erin said finally. "Yes, with more men, probably." Then Darren looked at her. In the dim candlelight, she looked tired, but not defeated. "Then we'll fight. There are only 4 of us. One of them is a child." "Tallow is braver than most men I know." Darren smiled weakly. "And Cale is a better shot than some sheriffs. But that won't be enough." Darren didn't answer right away. She was right. Fighting a whole gang with only 4 of them was suicide. But he wasn't just going to give up either. "There is a way," he said finally. "What is it?" "I'll ride away and lure them away from you." "No!" Their voices were sharp. "That's not a solution. It's the only solution." "No, it's not." She stood up, her eyes sparkling with determination. "You said we're family. Families don't abandon each other. Erin, you stay here. We'll find another way." The next morning, that other way presented itself. Cale returned excitedly from the well, where he had collected water. "Mother, someone's coming," he said. Darren immediately reached for his colt, but Cale shook his head. "Just one, and he's wearing a badge." They stepped outside and saw a lone rider approaching. It was an older man with a gray beard riding a tired horse. The sunlight flashed off the star on his vest. "Sheriff McKenna," Darren muttered. "What does he want here?" The sheriff stopped in front of them and slowly dismounted. He moved stiffly, like a man who had spent too many years in the saddle. "Miss Dalker," he said politely, tipping his hat. Then he turned to Darren. "Mr. Kyle." Sheriff McKenna was an honest man in a dishonest world, a rarity in these parts. Darren respected him, even though they were on opposite sides of the law. "I assume you know why I'm here," McKenna said. "Probably because of Morrison. He was in town yesterday, claimed that you and your men had attacked him and wanted me to arrest you." Darren waited. McKenna wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. It was strange, though, that before the sheriff left, he said that Morrison's story didn't quite add up.
He said they had ambushed him, but Tom Bradley has a store on the outskirts of town. He said he saw 4 horsemen riding this way, not the other way around. Aaron stepped forward. Morrison and his men came onto our land and threatened us, Sheriff. Darren was just defending us. McKenna nodded slowly. I thought so. He looked at Darren. Nevertheless, there's a warrant out for your arrest. Time from Tombstone. I know. But you see, I have a problem. McKenna scratched his beard. Morrison threatened me, he continued. He said that if I didn't bring them to him, he'd take care of it himself with a bigger group, and that would be vigilante justice. I don't tolerate vigilante justice in my district. McKenna suddenly grinned. Besides, he continued, I've done some research on Morrison. What I found out was very interesting. He pulled a folded piece of paper out of his pocket. A telegram from New Mexico. It looks like Morrison robbed a bank there for 3 months. Witnesses identified him. Darren stared at the paper. It meant that Jake Morrison was the one they were looking for, not her. McKenna folded the paper back up. At least here, in my district. Aaron grabbed Darren's arm. That means you're free, but not completely, McKenna said. The warrant from Tombstone is still valid. But if Morrison comes back here, I'll arrest him, not you. Darren felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had been carrying for months. For the first time in a long while, he could see a future that wasn't paved in violence. Thanks, Sheriff. But don't thank me too soon, McKenna warned. Morrison won't like this. He'll try to kill you before I can arrest him. Then we'll be ready, Darren said firmly. McKenna looked at her with new respect. Yes, ma'am. I believe so too. When the sheriff rode away, Tallow spontaneously hugged Darren. So you're staying here? Darren looked at Aaron, who smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had seen since arriving. Yes, he said. I'm staying here. But everyone knew the fight wasn't over. Morrison would come and do everything in his power to kill Darren before the law could catch up with him. The next few days brought a strange kind of peace. Darren continued to work on repairs around the homestead, but with a different mindset. He no longer worked out of guilt or duty. He worked because this had become his home. Aaron watched him transform their little family's life. He taught Tallow how to set rabbit traps, showed Kale how to clean a colt properly, and helped Lut to repair the vegetable garden. Small things, but important things. You look better, she said one evening as they milked the goats together. I feel better. It's not just that. She paused in her work and looked at him. You look more peaceful. Darren thought about her words. Peace.
It was something he had almost forgotten. For years, his life had been a constant struggle, a never-ending race to evade law enforcement and bounty hunters. Here, in this small corner of the prairie, he had found something he thought was lost forever. Your family has changed me, he said simply. Aran blushed slightly. We are your family, Darren. That's different. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep, they sat by the window again. But this time, Darren didn't keep watch. They just talked about their dreams, their fears, and their hopes for the future. What will you do when this is all over? Asked Aran. What do you mean? When Morrison is gone? When you're truly free? Will you move on? Darren thought long and hard before answering. Where would he go? I've found everything I need here. And what is that? He looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away. A family, he said quietly. A home. A reason to live instead of just survive. Her heart began to beat faster. Since her husband's death, she had sworn never to love again. It was too painful and risky. But Darren was different. He was strong enough to protect her, but also gentle enough to understand her fears. Darren began to speak, but Aran gently placed a finger on her lips instead.
"You don't have to say anything," he whispered. "I know it's complicated." "No, it's not." She took his hand. "It's the easiest thing in the world." That night, they kissed for the first time, gently and hesitantly, as if they were afraid of breaking something precious. The next morning, they both felt a change. It wasn't dramatic. They didn't constantly hold hands or exchange tender glances, but there was something in the air, a new warmth and hope. Cale noticed it first. "Are you going to marry him?" he asked his mother as they fed the cattle together. Aran blushed. "Cale? It's okay," the boy said quickly. "I like him. He's a good man." "How do you know? He could have left us after Morrison left." "But he stayed. He could have taken the money from Morrison's pocket when he knocked him down, but he didn't." Cale shrugged. "Besides, he makes you smile." Taylor was less subtle. At dinner that evening, he simply announced, "Darren is my new dad now, right?" The silence that followed was awkward. Darren cleared his throat awkwardly while Aran searched for words. "Taylor, it's not that simple." "Why not?" The 10-year-old looked confused. "He lives here, he works here, he protects us, and you kiss each other." "You saw us kissing." Her face turned red as a tomato. "You weren't very secretive," Taylor grinned. Darren began to laugh softly at first, then louder and louder. Soon they were all laughing and the tension dissolved. "If that's the case," Darren finally said, "then we should make it official." He stood up, went to his bag, and took something out. A simple gold ring. "It belonged to my mother," he explained. "It's the only thing I have left of her." Aran stared at the ring, tears in her eyes. "Aran Dulka," said Darren, kneeling down in front of her. "Will you be my wife?" "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." That night they celebrated with the last of the whiskey her late husband had left behind. There wasn't much, but enough for everyone to have a sip. Even the boys were allowed a tiny sip. "To the family," said Darren, raising his glass. "To the family," they all repeated. But their joy was clouded by the knowledge that Morrison was still out there. He would come, and when he did, he would try to destroy everything they had built. The next morning, the news came. Tom Bradley rode over from town, his face serious. "Morrison is back, with 8 men. They're coming tomorrow at sunrise." Darren felt his muscles tense. That's bad odds, even with Cale and the sheriff. 8 men. "Where's McKenna?" he asked. "Dead," Bradley replied grimly. "Morrison shot him this morning. He claims it was self-defense." Aran reached for Darren's hand. "What do we do now?" Darren looked at her, then at the boys, and finally at the small farmstead that had become his home. He had a choice. He could flee and get his new family to safety, or he could stay and fight. "We fight," he said calmly. "We're a family, and families don't abandon each other." Cale nodded solemnly. "Tell us what to do." Darren began to make plans. They had 1 day to prepare. 1 day to transform a peaceful farmstead into a fortress. It would be the most important day of their lives. The morning of the battle dawned clear and cold. Darren had got up before sunrise to check their defensive positions one last time. They had worked all night moving furniture in front of the windows, cutting loopholes in the walls, and setting traps around the house. Meanwhile, Cale lay on the roof of the shed with the old shotgun, from which he had a good view of the prairie. Taylor was hiding in the basement, under instructions to only come out when it was all over. Aran crouched behind the overturned kitchen table, holding an old pistol that she had inherited from her late husband. Darren had taken up position behind the well. Morrison Cold was at the ready. His pockets were filled with all the bullets they had been able to find in the house. 16 of them. That wouldn't be enough against 8 men. "Here they come," Cale whispered from the roof. Darren peered over the edge of the well. 8 dark silhouettes appeared on the horizon, the horsemen riding slowly towards them. They rode slowly and confidently, like men who knew they had the advantage. "Remember the plan," Darren shouted to the others. "Only shoot if you have a clear shot. Don't waste ammunition." Morrison led the group, identifiable by his distinctive black hat. As they got closer, Darren could make out the other faces. They were tough men with cold eyes who killed for money. They stopped 50 meters from the house. Morrison called, "Darren, Cale, time for the finale." "Then come and get it," Darren shouted back. Morrison laughed. "Oh, I will. But first, let's have a little fun." He signaled to his men. 4 of them dismounted and began to surround the house, while the others stayed behind to provide cover. "Here we go," Darren muttered. The first shot came from Cale. The old shotgun thundered, and one of Morrison's men staggered and grabbed his shoulder, cursing loudly. It was a good hit, but not fatal. The response was not long in coming. Bullets whistled through the air, hitting the walls of the house and shattering wood, sending dust flying. Darren waited until one of the attackers came within range. Then he fired. The man fell backward and didn't move. "One down," he muttered to Lute, but Morrison was smarter than Darren had thought. While 2 of his men attacked the house head-on, the others made a wide arc around the farmstead and approached from behind. "Cale!" Darren shouted. "Behind you!" The boy turned around just in time to see an attacker climbing onto the shed roof. A shot rang out and Cale screamed. Blood seeped from his arm, but he was still able to fight. Suddenly, she was in motion. She jumped out from her hiding place, ran to the shed, and fired her pistol at the man who had injured her son. The attacker stumbled and fell off the roof, landing hard in the dust. "Mom!" Cale cried gratefully, but her movement had made her visible. Morrison aimed at her, a cruel smile on his face.
"No!" Darren screamed, jumping out of cover and forgetting all caution. Morrison turned towards him, and for a moment the 2 men stood facing each other, the lawless avenger and the greedy killer. They both fired at the same time. Morrison's bullet grazed Darren's ribs, tearing flesh and fabric. Darren's bullet hit Morrison in the chest, right in the heart. Morrison stared in disbelief at the red flower blooming on his chest. Then he slowly fell forward, landing face down in the dust. The fight was over. The remaining men threw away their weapons and surrendered. Without Morrison, they were just ordinary bandits, leaderless and directionless. Darren sank to his knees, pressing his hand against his bleeding side. Erin ran to him, tears in her eyes. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Just a scratch," he lied, smiling weakly. Cale climbed down from the roof, holding his wounded arm. Tallow emerged from the cellar, his eyes wide with excitement. "Did we win?" the little boy asked. "Yes," said Darren, pulling him into a hug. "We won." Later, after tending to the wounded and tying up the surviving attackers, they sat outside the house and surveyed the damage caused by the battle. The house was riddled with bullet holes, the fence was destroyed, and the vegetable garden had been trampled. "We'll rebuild everything," Erin said quietly. "All of us, together," Darren agreed. A new cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, but this time there was no cause for concern. It was the new sheriff, accompanied by a group of deputies who had come to arrest the survivors of Morrison's gang. "Looks like your problem's solved, Cale," said the sheriff when he saw the handcuffed bandits. "Yes," said Darren, putting his arm around Erin. "All our problems are solved." The sheriff nodded and rode away with his prisoners. Silence returned to the prairie, but it was different to before. It was the peace that follows a storm, the calm that comes when you know you are safe. "So," said Talo, grinning, "when's the wedding?" Darren and Erin looked at each other and started laughing. They had survived the fight of their lives. Now they could finally start their lives together. 3 months later, Darren stood in front of the small mirror in the rebuilt cabin, trying to straighten his tie. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from excitement. "Need some help?" Cale appeared in the doorway, elegantly dressed in his only decent suit. "I think I can manage," Darren muttered, continuing to struggle with the stubborn tie. Cale stepped closer and took over the task with the natural ease of a son helping his father. Over the past few months, the once suspicious 15-year-old had grown into a young man who not only respected Darren but loved him too. "Nervous?" Cale asked with a grin. "Terrified," Darren admitted. "I fought armed bandits, but the idea of standing in front of the whole town and taking off my clothes? Mom's nervous too. She's done her hair 3 times already." Through the window, they could see the first guests gathering in front of the small church. There weren't many of them. The neighbors from the surrounding ranches, Tom Bradley and his family, and the new sheriff and his wife. But for Darren and Erin, that was more than enough. These people had become their community and their extended family. "Done," said Cale, stepping back to admire his work. "You look like a real gentleman." Darren looked at himself in the mirror. The man staring back at him was no longer the wounded, desperate refugee who had arrived on a dying horse months ago. This was a man with a family, a home, and a future. "Time to go," said Talo, rushing into the room. He was wearing his best suit, with an oversized tie knot, and his smile was brighter than the sun. People were waiting. They walked to the church together, Darren and his 2 stepsons, who were already like his own sons. The preacher, an old man with kind eyes, was waiting for them at the altar. Then the doors opened, and Erin entered. Darren forgot to breathe for a moment. She wore a simple white dress that Miss Bradley had sewn for her, and her hair was adorned with wild prairie flowers. She wasn't the most beautiful woman in the world, but to Darren, she was perfect. She walked slowly down the aisle, her eyes fixed on his. When she reached him, he took her hands and felt them tremble slightly. "You look beautiful." "So do you," she whispered, back, smiling. The ceremony was simple and moving. As they exchanged vows, they spoke not only to each other, but also to their sons standing at their feet. "I promise to love and honor you, and to protect this family for as long as I live. I promise to trust you and follow you, and to create a home with you where love and hope can flourish." When the preacher declared them husband and wife, the small gathering cheered. Tullo whistled shrilly through his fingers, and Cale couldn't help but grin broadly. The reception took place on the farmstead that they had rebuilt and improved over the past few months. The new house was larger and stronger, with real glass windows and a proper chimney. The vegetable garden was lusher than ever, and 3 healthy horses stood in the new stable. Tom Bradley raised his glass. "To Darren and Erin, may your love be as enduring as the prairie and as strong as the mountains. Long may they live," everyone shouted, drinking to the toast. As evening fell and the guests said their goodbyes, the new family sat outside their house and gazed at the endless expanse of the prairie. The stars began to appear, little lights in the velvety darkness. "Do you regret it?" Erin asked quietly, nestling against Darren's shoulder. "Regret what? That you didn't move on? You could have been free, with no responsibility for us." Darren laughed softly. "Free? I was never more trapped than in the years before I found you. Being free doesn't mean being alone. It means being with the people you love." Cale, who was carving a piece of wood, looked up. "What about your past? The men who hunted you?" "The new sheriff offered me a job as a deputy.
It seems like my skills are needed on the right side of the law." "Are you going to take it?" asked Talo excitedly. "Maybe, but only if I can come home in the evenings, to my family." A year later, their transformation was complete. Darren was wearing a deputy's badge and had earned a reputation as a fair but unyielding lawman. Erin blossomed. Her illness seemingly had disappeared, replaced by newfound energy and joie de vivre. Cale was preparing to go to college in the autumn, and Talo had grown into a confident young man who proudly showed visitors around the farm. The house was often full of guests, travelers seeking shelter, neighbors in need of advice, and even former outlaws looking for a fresh start. Erin and Darren welcomed them all because they knew what it was like to need a second chance. One summer evening, as they sat on the porch once again, a rider appeared at the end of the road. He rode slowly and cautiously, as though he weren't sure if he was welcome. "Should I get the shotgun?" Cale automatically asked.
"No," said Darren, standing up. "I don't think that will be necessary." The rider stopped in front of the house. He was a young man, barely older than Cale, with hungry eyes and torn clothes. His horse was exhausted and almost out of strength. "Excuse me," said the young man hesitantly. "I'm looking for work, any work. I can do anything." Darren looked at Ira, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Get down," said Darren. "You look like you could use a warm meal." "I don't have any money." "Didn't anyone ask for money?" Iran said kindly. "Come in. We'll talk over dinner." As the young man gratefully dismounted, Darren smiled. The circle was complete. They had been taken in by people who had helped them in their time of need. Now they could pass on that kindness. "What's your name?" Talo asked the stranger. "James," said the young man. "James Parker." "Welcome home, James," said Iran. Later, after James had fallen asleep in the shed, full and happy, and the boys had gone to bed, Darren and Iran stood once more in front of their house. The endless prairie stretched before them, but they no longer felt alone. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" Iran asked. "Every day," said Darren, pulling her closer. "And every day, I'm more grateful." "For what?" "For the day my horse carried me here. For your kindness. For the chance to become a better man." He kissed her gently, celebrating the family they had become. In the distance, a coyote howled, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like a welcome to all those looking for a home. In the warm light streaming from their house's windows, Darren and Iran did not see the end of their story, but the beginning of countless new ones. Stories of people finding hope, families being formed, love taking root across all boundaries.